is my pleasure to share the findings from my research paper titled An Analysis of the Role and Impact of Fiscal and Governance Policies Towards Maximizing the Progress of SDGs with Focus on Best Practices in India. So, to share with you briefly, I am a youth activist, climate advocate, change maker, and a student. I work with the mentioned organizations towards advancing SDG 4, SDG 5, SDG 12, and SDG 13. Moving on, through today's presentation, I will be breaking down my research paper in the following 5 parts so that the crux of the paper can be shared with you all, and so that I can give you an overview of my paper, which will also be published in the conference proceedings for your reference. To begin with, the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, were designed for a just and equal world. Though their outcomes and performance rates exhibit their imperfections. Based on MDG, the UN member states framed agendas and political policies over the next 15 years, which started from 2016 to 2030, now known as the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, and adopted at the UN Summit in 2015. They comprise of 17 goals and 169 targets that covers varied sustainable development goals, topics as its key commitments and principles. This paper reviews the achievement made by SDG so far, as their deadline for completion is fast approaching, highlighting the financial gaps that are currently present. So, as we all are aware, there are 17 goals to the SDGs that were adopted at the UN Summit 2015. These goals further have 169 targets, which define specific goals to be achieved. Thus, SDGs are holistic, universal, definite, focused, and consist of comprehensive targets. Through this paper, I analyzed the fiscal ways and mechanisms that are crucial in accelerating the progress of SDGs achievement, particularly among LDCs and small island development. It was also established how states and the public sector can play a critical role in financing many areas of the SDGs to close the remaining gaps. There was also a portion which reflected on the cost impact of sustainability, economic viability, and feasibility of SDG, and how countries can incorporate SDG goals within their national agendas while being mindful of their GDPs and available resources. So, when we talk about sustainable development, it is very important to keep in mind that the 4 intertwined dimensions of sustainable development, which are society, environment, culture, and economy, are crucial in progressing sustainable development in a country. Without one, the other cannot function properly to ensure sustainable development. Sustainable development, as you can see, has been defined in the following few ways, which are highlighted. And since it's a wide concept, keeping in mind the various definitions throughout this presentation will help you in understanding the financing concepts better. So, it is a worthwhile proposition to consider this table, which provides a comparative analysis of sustainable development and traditional development. So sustainable development enhances the quality of life of all citizens and the country's economy, making them economically viable and feasible in the long run. The initial adoption of sustainable development is quite expensive and challenging, which deters countries from giving priority to them over traditional development. This creates a backlog and depreciation of the economy of a country. This is where the financial gaps come into play. Countries without internal financial backing are forced to continue with traditional development, exacerbating the societal and economical gaps between developing and developed countries. In this context, it is very important to understand how the SDGs are financed and what are the fiscal requirements to execute them. There exist various resources which highlight the fiscal requirements. However, it is difficult to choose from which estimate to go forward. Just like the definition of sustainable development, fiscal requirements are very wide ranging and require us to consider all possible estimates to recognize the financial requirements for countries while adopting and implementing the SDGs. So, what was interesting to note from the analysis, the role and impact of fiscal and governance policies towards maximizing the progress of SDGs was that for funding SDGs, countries still rely on the traditional funding approach like government revenues, taxes, income on public assets, and grants. What this does is that it prevents a holistic consideration of the various potential sources of capital. The need of the hour to implement SDGs fully is to consider and execute SDGs funding by attracting public, private, domestic, and international sources. Let us look at the two levels through which this can be achieved. So, talking about the global level, it is important to estimate and arrange the potential SDG revenue sources and utilization of SDG financing. My paper talks about innovative ways through which fiscal requirements can be met on a global level. To mention a few, restructuring and promoting financial investment is essential to receiving funds for the SDGs. At this point of time, the structure for financial investment is very restrictive. Broadening and restructuring financial investment will be monumental in changing how SDGs are implemented in developing countries with less funds. One of my favorite solutions is a globally coordinated carbon tax, which honestly would be a great way to stop exacerbated carbon footprints, automatically supporting the SDG 13 for climate action. Moving on a national level, countries can change the way SDGs are financially implemented by bringing forward better public policies and regulations to attract private sector investment and mobilizing private sector to contribute towards their implementation. Also, investing in clean technologies, innovation, and ways to reduce waste is key to achieve a sustainable economy and a huge step towards sustainable development. Lastly, I also think that increasing awareness among the masses is crucial, especially for developing countries where awareness is seriously lacking between, the policymakers and the citizens. So, to touch upon the Indian scenario for fiscal policies and governance towards SDG, it is important to note that the Niti Aayog, the apex public policy think tank of the Government of India, oversees the implementation of the SDGs in India. I am happy to share that transparency, accountability, and good governance has ensured fair and responsible use of financial resources in India. Breakthrough for the same can only be achieved when the subnational, which is in states and regions, plans and schemes are localized and recognized. This again comes under the Niti Aayog as it consists of policymakers from all regions coming together towards advancing the SDGs locally. So this slide provides the goal-specific work done in India. Due to time constraints, I will not be going into much detail about the work that has been done towards each and every sustainable development goal in India. But when we talk about financing the SDGs, poverty eradication and inclusive economic growth are the prime agendas for development that require additional resources in India. It is exciting to note that the governmental measures have improved life of 90 million people. However, Indian financial shortfall to achieve SDGs is around 533 lakh crore, which is 8.5 trillion US dollars. And so these are the following measures that have been undertaken. Again, you can read more about them in my paper because there's a lot of detailed explanation about each and every single one of the measures. So to conclude, my paper suggests measures like domestic public resources, international cooperation, and capacity building implementation by states through national financial frameworks and policies, which will be critical to achieve SDGs. These were the key highlights from the paper, which I would like to take a minute to highlight. Firstly, the financing of SDG has reached a point where either we plug the financial gaps through novel financing mechanisms or else the deadline will pass. It is a now or never situation. Secondly, talking about the Indian scenario, India is proactively working towards these goals through effective policy making and monitoring scheme progress against the targets. It is following a holistic approach to improving its ranking. Thirdly, it is very important to note that India is a developing and populated country that is doing its best to judiciously employ its regular resources and following innovative financing strategies towards these goals. The breakthrough can be made when several measures to motivate countries lacking in finances and facing similar financial constraints are adopted. On this note, I conclude my presentation and I am now open to taking your questions regarding my paper.
Right, thank you, Sheen. I see there's a question for you here. Let me just read it out. Sorry. Right, so the question is, what are the barriers to resource mobilization at the national level in India? And how can international cooperation in the framework of SDG 17 overcome these barriers? And are there any insights from your work on the above?
Okay, thank you for your questions. So firstly, on national level, resource mobilization is quite difficult because we do not have any sort of crowdfunding platforms that are used officially and is acclaimed by everyone to use. Like for crowdfunding, I am aware that there are resources in other countries, but our country does not have any crowdfunding resources, which is quite a problem because then when you live in a populated country, it is very easy for you to be scammed. So that is the reason why people in India are very reluctant to send money anywhere until and unless it is approved by the government. So that is the main issue towards resource mobilization. Talking about SDG 17, I believe your question is how can international cooperation in the framework of SDG 17 overcome these barriers? So yeah, of course, like I think these resources for crowdfunding and other resources that exist in the international platform can definitely be brought into India. But then again, it's a tedious process, and our country is also, based around self-reliance a lot. So people usually go for domestic businesses or organizations. So there's definitely a need for like partnership where international platforms could partner up with domestic entrepreneurs to kind of come up with a new crowdfunding or resource mobilization platform, so that of course there can be some sort of an official platform where people can connect and share resources. I hope that answers your question.
Right, thank you. Yeah, maybe just a quick question. So basically you touch on 14 measures that India has undertaken to finance SDGs. Maybe can you very briefly tell us which ones have been most impactful and what are the kind of best practices that you would advocate to other developing countries?
Okay, I think these are the measures. So I think increased official development assistance has been one of the one of the measure, which is very helpful in organizing foreign funds towards advancing of the goals. Of course, when you receive money from other countries or other international organizations, it is very important to organize that fund in the most fruitful way. So that is one measure that I would suggest to every country to go for, where there is a committee which is organizing these funds. Also, I think one would be promoting entrepreneurship and the private sector, which is a great way through which the Indian government is trying to build sustainable businesses, promoting domestic entrepreneurs and sustainability through schemes like Prime Minister's Employment Generation Program, Startup India, and Skill India. These are very famous in our country, and so every country can actually go for this. And kind of help out their citizens by promoting their businesses and their organizations. So again, that is one of the measures that I would suggest to everyone.
All right, thank you, Sheen. All right, over to you, Stella. There are no more questions in the Q&A for Sheen.
Thank you, Vichy, and thank you, Sheen. Very interesting presentation. We learned a lot about the Indian context.